How you doing there? Just a quickie before we start. On the Apple podcast, why don't you double click on David McWilliams Plus? It's right there when you open the podcast. You get ad-free, you unlock early access. Just double click and away you go. David McWilliams Plus. You get this pure and simple. To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
How you doing there? It is podcast time. Life is good here. We are back in the HQ, as John refers to as the Orange Lodge, which is not, but it's a little bit orange, it must be said, but only in colour, not in spirit. And of course, the poor old Orangies are going to be very upset this week because it was revealed this week that there are now more Catholics than Protestants in Northern Ireland. So the Orange Lodge is feeling particularly embattled. Flags are going to go up.
Come on, quick, light the bonfire.
I like the bony. Light that bony on the 11th night. Anyway, we will discuss that maybe at another stage. In fact, we did discuss it on Tuesday, again, in the context of what we were discussing about the UK itself. But now we want to keep with the international theme and we want to go to Russia. And the reason is the mobilization called up last week by Putin is seen by many, many people as the last kick of dying ass, the last move of a regime that has run out of options. But those options that they still have could be incredibly dangerous for all of us. And that is the fear. And we're going to go to an old mate of mine, Sasha Kabanovsky, who lives in Berlin, where there are many thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Russians in exile, in effect. They've been there since the Gorbachev/Yeltsin years, and it's a huge Russian community. We've spent many nights chatting, myself and Sasha, over the years about what's going on in Russia. I can think of no better man to discuss this moment in Russian history than Sasha. So we're going to go straight to Berlin. We're going to talk to Sasha about the next moves. Is it the end of empire? If it is, how does it play out? Now we're going to go to Berlin. Berlin has Berlin has the biggest expatriate Russian community in Europe, an extraordinary city where you will actually hear, in certain parts of Berlin, you will hear Russian as a matter of course. There's a huge Russian population there. I happen to know a few of them, and one of them is on the line. He is Sasha Kabanovsky. Sasha, how are you? Good to see you.
Well, I've been better, but lovely to see you, and great to have this opportunity to chat and catch up.
Yeah, Sasha, like the last time we were talking was very late at night in Berlin, and we were talking, this was before the war, and we were talking about Russia, we were talking about Ukraine, we were talking about how you see the whole thing play out. Neither of us had any sense. You might have had a sense that this was coming. I certainly didn't have a sense. This is about 2.5 years ago. We were having a chat about 2 years ago. Before we talk about Russia, give me a sense. Your background is quite typical for many, many people who are now Russian, Ukrainian, from the former Soviet Union.
So I was born in Kiev. I grew up in the States. My mother's family still lives in Kiev. My wife is Russian. I went back to Moscow in 97, lived there until 2014, met my wife in Moscow, married her, had 4 children in Moscow. Now my wife's family is in Moscow currently. And there are quite a number of families just like ours who go back generations spanning the border between Russia and Ukraine. So what is happening now is a true unmitigated tragedy.
And tell me, so you've got family in Ukraine, your wife's got family in Moscow, you're talking constantly. Give me a sense of the relationship between these two countries, the way in which these two countries are intertwined. Because I think sometimes it's very easy in a war situation to say there's Russians on one side, there's Ukrainians on the other side. But this idea that the links are incredibly close.
Well, I think that the links have, over the last 6 months, the links have become less close. And I think that there has never been a divide as wide as it is currently. And quite honestly, I don't think there's a way back. I don't think that there's a way back to the way that things were or the relationships. I mean, even after the fall of the Soviet Union, the countries were separate, but in essence, the border was more a formality than anything that anyone really paid attention to, except for political reasons. However, after February 23rd, 24th, this sense of separation has become palpable and irreversible. And so there's no going back. We're living in a completely new world. And the question is, what opportunities and threats exist in this new world, and how do we reasonably assess what can happen?
Now, I just want to say, last night I was talking to our mutual friend, Anastasia, in Berlin about something completely different, but she said about the mobilization in Russia. So she's talking to her friends. She's also talking to her friends who have kids of like 18, 19, 20 in Moscow. She says the mobilization is real. Is it?
Well, it's real. I have been doing nothing but for the last 2 days, consoling friends of my children. Obviously, they have friends they've kept in touch with who are school friends. Everyone is basically on the move. Everyone's in a panic. People are getting into cars, driving towards Georgia. They're driving towards Finland. I'm not sure if the borders with Finland are still open. The former president of Mongolia announced that Mongolia is open to receive Russians who refuse to serve in the military. This has made the war real. And this basically just shows the death knell of the Putin regime. This really, if nothing else, shows how disconnected the regime had become from the overall population. And nothing brings this more palpably to the consciousness of the people on the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg than the threat. And it's not the threat. 100%. If your son goes to war, he will be facing the best army in Europe at this point in time. Battle-hardened, well-equipped, well-led, motivated. This is World War II all over again for Ukraine. And if they get on the battlefield, the first 100,000, the first wave of this mobilization, as Russians call it, mobilization, which is the preparation of burial sites.
Wow, that's what the Russians are calling it.
Yeah, it's not the mobilization, it's the mobilization, from the word mogila, which is a cemetery plot.
So this is the burial rites. This is what Russians are talking about.
This is the burial rites. And if you remember 2.5 years ago when we were discussing this situation in Russia, I kept making the point that this is a regime that's built on lies. At a certain point in time, those lies come to haunt you. And this is the time to pay the piper. And the economy is non-existent. The future is bleak. What do you do? What's the future for the next generation? Even if the war is over, even if it ends tomorrow, what is there left to really sort of think about and hope for? And so you're seeing, I don't know, millions is probably not underestimating what the numbers are in terms of people trying to get out.
Yeah, panicking. I was looking at the price of flights, to Yerevan, the price of flights to Istanbul. Anywhere that there's an avenue out of Russia, you have, as you said, it could well be millions of people trying to get out. But
well, the shocking price I saw was 1,075,000 rubles to Dubai, which
how much is that in euros? Exchange rate?
So divide that by 60, so 20,000.
Wow.
Jeez.
Okay. So basically, so people are trying to get out. This is
get a nice meal on that flight.
That's very true. This is the last throw of the dice for this regime, you think? I mean, you were saying to me 2 years ago, look, hold on a second. They've blown 30 years of oil revenue. There's very little innovation in certain areas. There's no future for people. This is before the war. Let's talk about, what this regime has done to Russia, to the opportunities that existed, even potentially in 1997, 98, 99.
The regime, and I express my own opinion, but as far as I can tell, the regime is a swarm of locusts. So if the cupboard was half full at the fall of communism, and if the communists, for you may agree or disagree with the economic policies and the global vision, but at the same time, they left something behind. There was an infrastructure, heavy industry. There was something to rebuild. What Putin's regime has done is it's left nothing. The economy is non-existent. The worst thing that they've done, they've encouraged the most brilliant, the youngest, the people who any nation would love to have. They've basically destroyed their opportunity. There 5 million Russians immigrated During the Putin's regime from 2000 to 2022, okay, not including 22, a net migration of Russians, highly educated, totaled 5 million out of Russia. So those people that basically, those are the people that did not see opportunities for themselves in the future in a relatively, well, what was painted as a prosperous and Russia with a bright future under the leadership of this regime. Since the beginning of the war, estimates, I was checking the numbers yesterday, an estimated, I think it was as high as 5 million
Have left.
Over the last 6 months. So it might be less, but even if it's a million over the last 6 months. And what he has done over the last 2 days is he's put the final nail in the coffin. And with no hope, with destitution, and if anyone has traveled to Russia, and just as yourself, I mean, most have traveled to Moscow and St. Petersburg and maybe one or two large cities. Moscow and St. Petersburg are impressive. They're beautiful, fantastic architecture, history, and very light. But that's not Russia. That's 34 million people. Everything else, everything outside, you drive 60 kilometers outside of Moscow or St. Petersburg, and you see destitution that hasn't changed since World War II. 25% of the population, and I think Boris Johnson used this quote to great effect, don't have indoor plumbing. You know, this regime is built on cynicism. They truck out veterans every May 9th to Red Square. But these veterans, they live in hovels. They've given everything to this country in World War II, and they have absolutely nothing. And so you can't build a future on nothing. And this is what they've destroyed. They've destroyed hope. They've destroyed the future. And what I'm afraid what we're seeing is I wrote one of my favorite quotes from Hemingway is, how do you go bankrupt? First very slowly and then very quickly. And I believe that we're in the very quickly phase of Russia not going bankrupt, but Russia ceasing to exist as an empire, as a country, and quite frankly, maybe even more deeply than that.
Explain this to me, because this is what we talked about a couple of years ago, and I was fascinated because I was sitting opposite you and I was listening to you, and you had this very profound sense of what was likely to happen. This is before the war. This is just as events were playing out. So explain that to me. How does this end? How does this potential catastrophe unfold in Russia? In terms of what you were saying, the empire, the country, even the feeding of the people themselves.
Well, unfortunately, I cannot picture a good ending. I don't see a scenario with a good ending. I see scenarios with more or less bad endings and horrible endings.
Okay, well, let's look at those ones.
So the problem with Russia is if you look at the statistics for average lifespan, and if you look at the average lifespan of the average Russian male, I think it's currently down to 65, 64. So the average Russian man, statistically, he will not reach his retirement age.
It's extraordinary.
The level of alcoholism, all you have to do is just sign on to one of these telegrams.
Yeah.
Which document the mobilization and the types of people that this is attracting and that are being rounded up. They're in a drunken stupor. And so the problem, as I see it, is that I don't want to overgeneralize. It's a very dangerous game to play, but there's a real sense that the nation has exhausted itself. It's just, this was the last big push, the last big chance where Russia had and Russians had to build a new country, a new vision, and they screwed it up. Ukraine is no great achiever over the last 20 years.
No, absolutely
and
not.
the level of corruption in Ukraine rivals any place else in the world. But having said that, no president in Ukraine has served more than 2 terms.
Yeah, and I've always said that even the very act of voting in a comedian as president reflects a very vibrant democracy. Because what you're saying is anybody can turn up and put themselves before the people, and the elections are relatively uncorrupt, and you have a vibrancy of debate and discussion. But I take your point about the corruption. The corruption, when I was in Kiev, late 80s all the way through the early noughties, there was an extraordinary sense that the country was also being pilfered by its own oligarch class. And that was very, very enmeshed with the political class. So, as you said, this is no shining light in terms of corruption. However, they do have a vibrant dissenting culture. And of course, that's come to be probably embodied in Zelensky as an individual.
Well, you cannot build a democracy where none existed overnight. And it's a painful process, and there will be excesses. But there has to be a will. And the people have to be willing to pay a price. And the Russians were not willing to pay a price. See, Navalny, and I'm sorry about this haphazard sort of jumping around,
okay.
but the topic is very, very big and very emotional, and it's hard to cover in a short period of time. But since so many things have been happening, but the first thing I want to underscore, which is important in the context of this war, the Zelensky is not just a comedian; he's a Jew. Okay. And that's a very important fact, because this entire premise of this war is based on fighting Nazism. Now, the cynicism, I can't imagine another government that would be cynical enough to wage a war of denazification against the country that elected the first Jewish president.
Yeah, no, it's extraordinary.
And they've managed to do this. And it seems like they've convinced themselves that they're believing their own lies. And it's like they're the only people left in the room talking, because no one's paying any more attention. And that's bygone. So that is very important. And the other thing is that Ukraine has gotten a foundation story. And just look at how the 250 Azov heroes were welcomed in Ukraine with their release. The entire nation celebrated. You didn't see anything similar to this in Russia with the release of their 50 prisoners or whatever else, because the people just don't care anymore. There is an existential feeling that they're exhausted. They know that they're living a lie, and at this point in time, the hard truth has basically hit them in the face, and it's a panic. And there's no more dangerous situation than a dying empire in a panic with lots of nuclear weapons.
Well, that's the terrifying prospect, particularly with the president, who doesn't only hint at it, actually says, I'm not bluffing, I will use these things. Or I could use these things.
Well, you play poker, right?
Quite badly.
Well, so do I. But Shakespeare said, methinks thou dost protest too much.
Yeah.
These people they don't have a death wish, and they don't have the courage. One thing that is absolutely true is that they're not courageous, and they're bullies. They've bullied this country for 22 years, and the only reason why they've gotten away with it is because, unfortunately, Russia has a history of servility stemming from a history of serfdom that, in essence, formally was done away with in 1863, but in reality, the disdain for human life in Russia and the Russian culture has maintained this servile serf class to this day. And in Russia, it's impossible for the Western mind to understand, because we simply do not treat people this way in Western culture. In Russia, in 2020, if you ride around in a Rolls Royce and if you have a fat bank account, you can basically treat anyone below you as genetic garbage. People ran over children. You could kill someone and you would get away scot-free. You would not face legal consequences. And that's not a society that's long for this world.
No, I agree with you. I completely agree with you. And yet, the last time we were chatting, you actually sent me some lines of poetry. This very, very famous was a Tchaikovsky idea. Explain that to me, and why there is something deep in that poem, and why Russians believe it, or do they still believe it? Actually, what is the poem again? Because I remember we were talking. You said read this.
You mean? I don't remember exactly, because we exchanged so much poetry and quotations. The one that's most applicable, I think, in this day and age is it's not a poetry. It's basically a saying, which is "Умом Россию не понять, в Россию можно только верить." And so the meaning of it is that you can't understand Russia with the mind. The only thing that you can do is believe in Russia.
Yeah, you just have to believe in her.
In her, yes, and that encapsulates the Russian attitude completely. There's an irony to it. So it's self-deprecating from one perspective, but also something that speaks deeply, and Russians are really, really proud that despite everything, despite our own shortcomings, despite poor leadership, despite the fact that we don't run the country very well, we always come out on top. And it's the belief.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to overstate this, but in very large part, this is due to the role of orthodoxy. It's a long topic, and I've been giving this a lot of thought, but there's a mysticism to Russia. There's this sort of unbridled belief in the fact that everything will just turn out all right. So, you drive at 200 kilometers on a road that's not made for it. And, Russians will say, pronесло. So, you'll sort of survive and get by. But
the Irish expression is, it'll be grand.
Yeah, well, it's grand because life in Russia is geared towards survival and not prosperity.
Sasha, just explain to me, you were telling me the last time we chatted about the vastness. You were talking about, Siberia is a problem. There's a moment where the central forces of Russia cannot hold the place together. The resource-rich parts of Russia are beyond the Urals. They're very much Asiatics. The Russian Far East is very beyond China. How does this play out? How does this, how does the whole thing end?
We're beginning to see this, right? So the first thing that happened was Azerbaijan attacked Armenia. The second thing, Kyrgyzia and Tajikistan started to fight in an area where now you have an independent Afghanistan and the resurgent Taliban and Islamic fundamentalism. I don't know what's happening with China, but you have 1.2 billion Chinese sitting right across the border. Not just sitting. I mean, they've been actively moving people into the borderlands of Russia. So the entire Siberian, the entire area of Siberia, which, by the way, Russia conquered from China up to the beginning of the 18th century. So when Putin makes these historical arguments about what geography tells us and history tells us about where people should be, there's a compelling one that China can certainly drag out about getting some territorial historical payback. And it's populated by just 30 million people.
So there's only 30 million Russians in Siberia?
Yes.
So from the Urals to Vladivostok. So this huge, 5 time zones?
5 time zones, yes.
There's
5 time zones inhabited by 30 million people. And the infrastructure is... Nothing's been invested in infrastructure. I'm not sure, but I don't think that you can actually drive from Moscow to Vladivostok in a car on a paved road all the way.
And you have 1 billion Chinese people living down south. So you have 30 million Russians,
yes,
1 billion Chinese.
1 billion Chinese, of course. And strange things have been coming out of China over the last week. So I'm sort of interested and constantly messaging back and forth with my friends in Hong Kong, trying to figure out what's going on. But it's like there are threats all over the place. So Kadyrov, one of the interesting things actually, which I think went unnoticed in the West, was that Kadyrov, who is the head of Chechnya, how did he call himself? Putin's foot soldier.
Yeah.
So he announced that the demobilization will not be carried out in Chechnya, which is. Basically, if you want to send a message to the Kremlin that the game is over, that's pretty much the way that you do it. Because understanding the stakes of mobilization for Putin and his regime, to come out and say that we've overfilled our quotas in the first phase of the war, and we're not going to do this in the second phase of the war, it's treasonous.
Yeah.
Dagestan is in an uproar. Tatarstan has everything that a functioning country can hope for, and an indigenous population and a history of independence from Russia before the 15th century. So, and recognizing the fact that Russia actually does not have a military, because let's face it, Russia, it does not have a military. It has a bunch of generals dressed in glitzy sort of autocratic uniforms. It has missiles of dubious sort of quality. And it cannot fight a war, and it cannot exert its power, and it has a large police presence, which it's not a fighting force. It's a force of oppression, suppression. They're great at using batons against peaceful demonstrators, but they're not a military force, and they're, I think, about 2 million of them. So if you can't feed this machine of oppression, you can't hold this thing together. There are way too many external factors, internal pressures that are beginning to crack the regime and to crack the country. And it's going to be painful. It's going to be painful. And I hope that the West has a strategy for how to mitigate this situation. And actually, I think that it's obvious that there's a rift between Putin and the Ministry of Defense. And if one had to make a bet on who can get rid of Putin and keep a semblance of stability within the country and make sure that at least the military arsenal that is still functioning can be held in check, it's the military. And then ironically, right, the military is the only part of the system that actually can make the argument and can negotiate a reasonable settlement, because the military can just say, look, we're the military, right? You're the military. We're the military. You were told to go into Afghanistan, whether you liked it or not, you went in. We're not basically entitled to make big political decisions. We have to carry out the orders up until the point where we see that, and this point has come. And so there could be a negotiation for a post-Putin sort of solution and some semblance of control.
Just before we go, you just mentioned the West, right? The last time Russia imploded, the Soviet Union imploded, the West did not have a plan. Okay, it happened very, very quickly, late 80s, early 90s. Rather than a massive Marshall aid to Russia, rather than the West coming in and supporting, whether it was Gorbachev initially, there was this idea that, well, let's just pick over the pieces of this corpse as it rots in our midst. And that's what the West did. It didn't actually come in and have this big plan. I'm not hearing anything from Washington and or the European Union, which has the finance, might not have the actual muscle, but has the finance to do it. To what extent then does the post-Putin world, because I think you're right, I think we're looking into the post-Putin world, does it end up another vacuum in Russia, and then Russians leave, and then Russian money leaves, and you have another, a sort of a rinse and repeat of what happened 25 years ago?
No, this is not a rinse and repeat of 25 years ago. This is something completely different. It's something more profound. It's something that's much more, I don't want to over dramatize, but it is not. And it is the end of the empire. Russia, for all intents and purposes, they were able to sort of maintain more or less a historic Russian empire. Yes, some countries left, but the core remained intact.
Yeah.
This is the core. And this is, the United Kingdom, the British Empire in 46, 47, 48. But the problem is, whereas the British Empire was an overseas empire and countries could sort of gain their independence without actually, a dramatic impact on the home country. This is a land empire, right? Very intertwined. And when that collapses, the ramifications are significantly more profound. And I think trying to project what happens afterwards is definitely above my pay grade. But I certainly hope that someone in Washington, I don't have that much faith in the European Union at this point in time, trying to take the lead on this situation, because they've been behind.
But the Americans.
But the Americans, in fact, I read somewhere, I think about a week ago, that a top-ranked U.S. general came to NATO with precisely that agenda, which is to try to prepare for the potential dissolution of Russia. And I think you need to, like after World War II, right? You have to find the most rational thing. Maybe it's unpalatable, but the most rational thing is you have to find the remaining sort of center of power and try to prop that up, because you can't afford to have this thing just collapse under its own weight. It has to be a controlled process.
And you need a sort of a Konrad Adenauer, to actually lead the new country and say, okay, this is a new chapter, but I'm German, I'm one of you, I feel what we went through, and we can rebuild, which is precisely what the Americans found in Adenauer after Hitler.
Yes, but once again, the cupboard is bare, and you can't use people from the old regime because the failure is so massive and so total. Navalny is in jail, despite the fact that he's very brave. He's done tremendous work on uncovering corruption. Unfortunately, it fell on deaf ears, which says something about the Russian population in general. Can you imagine someone who day after day in the UK or Ireland or the US documents unparalleled levels of corruption, and it does not resonate at all within the general population? So it's a sign. But he has never been able to build that broad-based support to, I think, offer sort of a reasonable alternative as a potential leader for Russia in the future. Maybe it's possible, but I just don't think that he has that charisma or the support of the general population. Maybe we'll get lucky and something comes up. Some hero, I need a hero. So
I didn't think we would end with a quote from Bonnie Tyler, which is, we're talking Russian poetry, history, whatever. And we end in, I think it is Swansea, South Wales, mid-1980s. I'm holding out for a hero, John.
Big hair, the whole lot.
Big hair, the whole lot. Listen, Sasha, that was like a fantastic discussion. Really, really wonderful. I will see you hopefully in the face-to-face. We'll have a couple of drinks, have a couple of chats, but we will definitely come back to this issue because this is a moving story and this thing could be over in weeks or months.
Or days.
Or days. Sasha, listen, take care.
Thank you, gentlemen. Have a nice day. Thank you.
Do you know, it's absolutely fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and emotional stuff if you're involved. That's the thing.
Really emotional. And he was getting really emotional.
Well, like you have 4 kids born in Russia. They're Russian. Your wife's Russian. You're Ukrainian. I mean,
yeah.
You've got businesses in Russia. You've got friends in Russia. You've seen the whole thing unravel.
But what I find really interesting is his take on the regime itself and how, as he said, how disconnected it is from the people and the old Russian vets living in hovels and poverty.
Have been rolled out on the 9th of May, yeah.
But also, what I was thinking there as well, a few weeks ago, there was a big meeting in Uzbekistan from all the...
Samarkand.
Yes, yeah.
The ancient city of Samarkand.
It's actually on my bucket list as a place to go.
We'll be doing a podcast from Samarkand before you know it.
I hope so, Mac. I hope so. But what I found really interesting was, like, not only is he disconnected from the people of Russia, but he's becoming more and more disconnected from his so-called mates. Like Modi had a go at him. Saying,
Modi said, this is not the time for war, didn't he?
Yeah, he kind of said, will you hurry up and finish this yoke, more or less?
Well, the thing about politics, John, all this, it's like when you look through history, think about not politics, think about power. Power is all about momentum, right? If you're going forward and you're the powerful guy, loads and loads of people say, okay, I'll back this guy. But if you're seen to be going backwards, and this is what Modi is. So Modi was, they were all on side in February, China and India.
But this is exactly it.
And now it's like, hold on a second, who's the next guy? It's long live the king sort of idea. The king is dead, long live the king. Who's the next guy?
Yeah.
And I think you're absolutely right that what you have is an atrophying of this sort of tacit alliance around Russia. And that's a clear signal that the Indians are saying, okay, all right, you're the revolving door, you're gone. Who's the next geezer?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right that once that falls away, that isolates the regime. But the problem with a regime like this, as Sasha was saying, is the more isolated they are, maybe the more desperate they become.
Well, it's like a cornered rat. And, anybody who's
that Putin is referred to as Rat Boy. Do you know that? Yeah, one of the very interesting. I didn't know. We didn't expect to go. There is a biography of Putin, hagiography of Putin, written about how fantastic he is, right? And he tells a story. Putin himself tells a story. And John Sweeney, the British journalist, has a book called "Criminal in the Kremlin," and one of the chapters is called "Rat Boy." And it's actually a story that Putin tells about his youth. So Putin's born incredibly poor in St. Petersburg, Leningrad, okay? The family are living with lots of other Russian families sharing a loo, all that sort of stuff. Really, really poor. He talks about one day that
sharing a loo?
Sharing, that's the toilet between 20 families,
God almighty.
And I've been in those flats in Leningrad. I've been in big, big Soviet flats. They're pretty.
Oh my God, the thought of that. Don't go anyway. Move on.
Anyway, but Putin says about when they were kids that they were used to chase rats. They were little kids, that's what they did. It was like a game, let's chase a rat today. And he was talking about he cornered a rat and a rat went for him. Putin tells that story. So it's very interesting.
Right.
And he's kind of almost identifying this is what a rat will do.
Yeah.
So Sweeney calls him Rat Boy, but this is part of the mythology about Putin.
Yeah.
But they are cornered. But what I found interesting was this notion that what Sasha was talking about is the essence of Russia, the soul of Russia, the heart of Russia, the mysteriousness of Russia, the myth of Russia. He says he thinks is now atrophying, and that held them together for a long time.
And also when he was talking about that, also it's the element of religion and the
Orthodox Church, yeah.
And the patriarch, I don't know if you've seen recently with the mobilization, the patriarch was talking about and lecturing, saying, if you go and fight for the motherland and you die in Ukraine, you will go straight to heaven. It's the same kind of stuff that ISIS leaders and Taliban leaders say to their boys, you know?
That's extraordinary. I had no doubt. It kind of dovetails. I mean, Sasha was linking orthodoxy with this idea of mystical religion.
Yeah.
That, I actually quite like mystical Catholicism, I've decided.
Okay.
I'm actually going to get into it.
Okay, we'll talk about that another time.
But mystical, you've got mystical sides of religion, which are not just the rules and regulations, but they're actual. It's the mystery. It's the fairy tale of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, if you come back to the Tuchev stuff we were talking about, Fyodor Tuchev, who is a Russian poet.
Right.
Yeah. And it's this idea that Sasha was talking, was that piece of poetry that he sent me, which is recited by Russian kids. I learned this, as well as a bit of Pushkin's poetry, like a bit of Pushkin's love poetry.
Yeah.
Yeah, vas lubil, lubovish show, music. I used to love her. It's like it's the poet. The poets. I used to love her is the great Pushkin poetry.
Yeah.
And of course, what do we do in Ireland? The I used to love her once.
Yeah.
Was from that,
long time ago.
What was that name? That was from Tume. What were they called? The Saw Doctors.
Saw Doctors. Yeah.
Listen to this quote, right? Tuchev. You cannot grasp Russia with your mind, John, or judge her by any common measure. Russia is one of a special kind. You can only believe in her. That is Fyodor Tuchev, one of the greats of Russian poetry, but they learn that in school. And what they're basically saying is...
It's like faith. It's like what we in our catechism.
Exactly. It's like Catholicism, except the problem is, John, with Russia, it's Catholicism with nukes. Now, remember, the 3rd to the 6th of November, Kilkenomics in Kilkenny, the world's only economics and stand-up comedy festival. And John, tickets have been absolutely flying.
That's brilliant.
Yeah,
that's fantastic.
It means people really want to come back out. All the stuff you hear in the podcast, all the voices, all your old favorites. We have many, many of our podcast legends coming in from all over the world to join us. Have a look at the lineup, kilkenomics.com, get your tickets, and we'll see you in Kilkenny.